I walked into my son's backyard and heard, "Why is she even still alive?" The words hit me like a physical blow, stopping me mid-step on the flagstone path I had helped Daniel and Tessa choose 3 years ago. I stood there, frozen behind the trellis of climbing roses I had planted with my own hands, and listened to my daughter-in-law's voice drip with casual cruelty as she spoke to someone on her phone. "I mean, seriously," Tessa continued, her voice carrying clearly through the evening air. "She just sits there at family dinners like some kind of ghost. Daniel feels obligated to invite her, but honestly, what's the point? She doesn't contribute anything to the conversation. She just exists." I'm Evelyn, and at 72 years old, I thought I had heard every possible way my own family could make me feel worthless. But standing there in the gathering dusk, listening to my son's wife wonder aloud why I was still breathing, I realized I had been catastrophically wrong about how low the bar could go. You see, for the past 8 years, ever since my husband died and left me rattling around alone in the house where we'd raised our children, I had been slowly, methodically erasing myself to make room for Daniel and Tessa's comfort. It started small, as these things always do. A suggestion that maybe I shouldn't tell quite so many stories about the old days because the kids get bored. A gentle redirect when I tried to share advice about child rearing because things are different now, Mom. A gradual reduction in my presence at family gatherings from participant to observer to barely tolerated furniture. I had given them $40,000 from my retirement savings to help with the down payment on this very house where I now stood eavesdropping on my own character assassination. When Daniel had come to me 3 years ago, hat in hand and voice thick with manufactured vulnerability, explaining how Tessa had found the perfect house, but they were just short on the down payment, I had signed over nearly half of what my husband and I had saved over 40 years of marriage. "It's an investment in the family's future, Mom," Daniel had said, his eyes bright with the prospect of home ownership. "And of course, you'll always be welcome here. This will be like a second home for you." A second home. What a lovely phrase. What a cruel joke. I had babysat their children, Emma and Jake, every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 2 years so Tessa could pursue her yoga instructor certification and Daniel could work late without worrying about childcare costs. I had cooked elaborate Sunday dinners for months, bringing entire meals to their house because Tessa found cooking overwhelming and Daniel was too busy to help with meal planning. I had bitten my tongue when they redecorated the guest room I had quietly begun thinking of as my room and turned it into Tessa's meditation space. I had smiled politely when they explained that my overnight stays were becoming disruptive to the children's routines. I had accepted shorter visits, fewer phone calls, and the gradual transformation from beloved grandmother and mother into an obligation to be managed. But I had never imagined that my very existence had become a source of irritation so profound that my daughter-in-law would casually wish for my death while standing in the backyard I had helped them afford. "She's not even that old," Tessa continued, apparently warming to her theme. "My grandmother lived to 94 and was sharp as a tack until the end. But Evelyn just seems so vacant, like she's already half gone, you know? Sometimes I wonder if it would be kinder if she just slipped away quietly." Kinder. She thought my death would be kinder. I stood there behind the roses for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, listening to Tessa elaborate on my various shortcomings and inadequacies. My clothes were outdated, my stories were repetitive, my presence made the children uncomfortable because I was too needy for attention. I breathed too loudly, I ate too slowly, I asked too many questions about their lives. According to Tessa, I was a burden that Daniel was too guilty to shed, a remnant from a previous era that they were stuck accommodating out of social obligation rather than genuine affection. The conversation eventually shifted to other topics. Tessa's yoga classes, vacation plans I apparently wouldn't be included in, renovations to the house I had helped them buy. But I had heard enough. More than enough. I should have left then. The old Evelyn, the Evelyn who had spent 8 years learning to make herself smaller and quieter and less inconvenient, would have crept away in shame and spent the evening wondering what she had done wrong, how she could be a better mother and grandmother, what changes she could make to earn back their tolerance. But something had shifted inside me as I stood there listening to my daughter-in-law casually discuss my death as if it were a scheduling inconvenience. Something that had been dormant for years was suddenly furiously awake. Instead of leaving, I walked around to the front of the house and rang the doorbell. Daniel answered, looking surprised to see me. "Mom, I thought you weren't coming over until Sunday." "I was in the neighborhood," I said calmly, "and thought I'd stop by to see the children." It was a lie, of course. I had driven 23 minutes from my house specifically to deliver the birthday gift I bought for Emma, whose 7th birthday party I had learned about through a Facebook post rather than a personal invitation. But Daniel didn't need to know that my surprise visit was actually a planned mission I'd been psyching myself up for all week. "Oh," Daniel said, stepping aside to let me in. "Well, the kids are getting ready for bed, but I'm sure they'd love to see you for a few minutes." I spent exactly 17 minutes in that house. I gave Emma her carefully chosen birthday present, a set of art supplies I'd selected based on her interest in drawing, which I had learned about not from her parents, but from watching her doodle on napkins during our last awkward family dinner. I read Jake a story from a book I'd brought, one of the same books I'd read to Daniel when he was Jake's age. I complimented Tessa's new throw pillows and asked polite questions about her yoga certification progress. I was pleasant. I was appropriate. I was exactly the kind of grandmother anyone would be lucky to have. And all the while, I was mentally taking inventory of everything in that house that existed because of my generosity, my labor, my love, the down payment that made their mortgage possible, the handmade quilts draped over their couch, the garden in their backyard that I had planted and maintained, the children's college funds I had been steadily contributing to since their births. I was cataloging it all because I had already decided that this would be the last time I would enter this house as a supplicant, hoping for scraps of affection from people who viewed my existence as an inconvenience. When I left that evening, I drove home in perfect silence, my mind remarkably clear for someone whose world had just been fundamentally reordered. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't call my sister or my neighbor or anyone else who might offer comfort or advice. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and a legal pad, and I began making lists. The first list was titled, "What I Have Given." $40,000 for their house down payment, approximately 4,000 hours of babysitting over the past 2 years, 37 Sunday dinners prepared and delivered, countless birthday gifts, Christmas presents, and just because surprises, $2,000 contributed to each child's college fund, furniture, quilts, garden tools, and household items given as housewarming gifts, emotional labor in the form of listening to their problems, offering advice, and providing unconditional support during difficult times. The second list was titled, "What I Have Received." This list was considerably shorter. Obligatory Mother's Day cards, Christmas gifts that were clearly afterthoughts, generic candles, drugstore bath sets, books by authors I'd never expressed interest in, invitations to family gatherings where I was tolerated rather than welcomed, polite but distant phone calls on my birthday, the privilege of being considered family furniture, present but invisible. The third list was titled What I Will Do. This list would grow considerably longer over the following weeks. I started with research. The next morning, I called Claudia Morrison, an estate planning attorney I'd met through my book club. Doris had recommended her highly after Claudia helped her navigate her own family drama involving ungrateful adult children who seemed to view their parents as ATMs rather than people. "Evelyn," Claudia said warmly when I called her office, "how lovely to hear from you. Doris mentioned you might be needing some legal advice." Had Doris mentioned that? I hadn't spoken to Doris about my situation, but perhaps my face had been more transparent than I'd realized during our last book club meeting. Or perhaps Doris, who was 81 and had raised 4 children, simply recognized the particular brand of exhaustion that comes from loving people who no longer see you as fully human. "I need to update my will," I said simply, "and I have some questions about power of attorney arrangements." We scheduled an appointment for the following Thursday. In the meantime, I began what I privately called my archaeological expedition, digging through years of financial records, legal documents, and family paperwork to understand exactly what I had given and what I could take back. The power of attorney was the first thing that had to go. I had signed it over to Daniel 5 years earlier when I was having surgery for a broken hip and needed someone to handle my affairs temporarily. Temporarily had somehow become permanently, and Daniel now had legal authority to make financial and medical decisions on my behalf, authority I had never formally revoked even after my full recovery. Claudia walked me through the revocation process with the kind of professional discretion that told me she'd handled similar situations before. "Are you sure you want to revoke this entirely?" she asked, not judgmentally, but making certain I understood the implications. Many people prefer to simply update their power of attorney to include additional safeguards or limitations. "I'm sure," I said. "I want complete control over my own affairs. And Daniel doesn't know you're planning this change." "Daniel doesn't know anything about what I'm planning." I surprised myself with how steady my voice sounded. "He's been making assumptions about my capabilities and my future that I no longer find acceptable." Claudia nodded as if this were the most reasonable thing in the world. "Let's talk about your will then. Doris mentioned you might want to make some significant changes." My will as it currently stood left everything to Daniel. The house, the remaining retirement funds, my husband's life insurance money, the small inheritance I'd received from my own parents, all of it was designated to pass to my son upon my death, with the understanding that he would take care of family obligations and remember my mother's wishes regarding his grandchildren's education. It was the kind of vague, trusting language that assumes your beneficiaries will be guided by love and moral obligation rather than legal requirements. It assumed that Daniel would use his inheritance responsibly, that he would honor my memory by treating my possessions with respect, that he would ensure Emma and Jake knew their grandmother had cared about their futures. It assumed, in other words, that Daniel was a different person than the man who had spent 8 years watching his wife systematically erase me from family life without once standing up for his mother's dignity. "I want to change everything," I told Claudia. "I want to leave my house to the Riverside Women's Shelter. I want my retirement funds to be divided between scholarships for first-generation college students and the local food bank. I want my personal possessions to be donated to charity, with the exception of a few specific items I'll designate for my granddaughter." Claudia took notes without visible reaction, but I caught her glancing up at me with what looked like approval. "And your son?" she asked, neutrally. My son will inherit exactly what he's given me. Nothing. I need to ask, Claudia said gently, whether this decision is being made in anger. The courts can sometimes challenge wills that appear to be written in retaliation rather than from genuine intent. I considered her question seriously. Was I angry? Certainly, but anger wasn't driving my decisions. Clarity was. "I'm not trying to punish Daniel," I said finally. "I'm trying to ensure that my legacy reflects my values. For the past 8 years, I've been treated as if my only purpose is to provide financial and practical support while expecting nothing in return. My current will assumes that dynamic will continue after my death, that I'll keep giving even from the grave while Daniel continues taking without acknowledgement or gratitude." I paused, choosing my words carefully. I want my death to benefit people who will appreciate what I'm giving them. I want my money to go to causes I believe in, to people who are struggling the way I struggled when I was young. I don't want it to subsidize the lifestyle of people who view me as an inconvenience they have to tolerate. Claudia finished writing and looked up at me with obvious respect. "That sounds like the opposite of a decision made in anger," she said. "That sounds like a decision made from wisdom." Over the following weeks, I methodically dismantled the infrastructure of my previous life. I revoked Daniel's power of attorney and updated all my financial accounts to reflect my sole authority. I rewrote my will with the kind of specific, detailed language that would leave no room for legal challenges or misinterpretation. I arranged for my house to be transferred to a trust that would benefit the Riverside Women's Shelter upon my death, ensuring that no one could contest or override my wishes. But the will changes were just the legal framework for a much larger transformation. The real work was psychological, learning to stop caring whether Daniel and Tessa approved of my choices, learning to stop hoping for affection from people who had made it clear that my value was purely transactional. I started small. When Tessa called to ask if I could babysit Emma and Jake the following Tuesday because her yoga instructor had scheduled a makeup class, I said no. "No?" Tessa's voice pitched higher with surprise. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean I'm not available on Tuesday," I said calmly. "I have other plans." It was true. I had plans to reorganize my closet and finally read the novel I had been meaning to start for months. They weren't plans that couldn't be rescheduled, but they were my plans, and I was learning to treat my own time as valuable. "But you always babysit on Tuesdays," Tessa said, as if my consistency were a legal contract rather than a gift I'd been freely giving. "I've been happy to help when I could, but I'm not always available. You'll need to make other arrangements." The silence that followed was thick with Tessa's confusion and irritation. She had grown accustomed to having an unpaid, on-call childcare provider, and my sudden insistence on being treated like a person with my own schedule and preferences was disrupting her carefully calibrated life management system. "Fine," she said finally, her voice cool with displeasure. "I'll figure something out." "I'm sure you will," I agreed pleasantly, and hung up before she could deploy whatever guilt-inducing tactics she was surely preparing. An hour later, Daniel called. "Mom, Tessa said you can't babysit anymore?" "I said I couldn't babysit on Tuesday. I didn't say I couldn't babysit anymore." "But you've always been available on Tuesdays. It's really important to Tessa's career development that she be able to rely on consistent childcare." "I understand that reliable childcare is important. Have you considered hiring a professional babysitter? There are several excellent services in your area." "We can't afford professional childcare," Daniel said, his voice taking on the wheedling tone he'd used since childhood when he wanted something. "You know our budget is tight with the mortgage and everything." The mortgage that I helped them afford with $40,000 of my retirement money.
the mortgage that had made their financial situation viable in the first place. "I'm sure you'll work something out," I said, echoing Tessa's earlier dismissal back to him. "You're both resourceful adults." "Mom, what's gotten into you lately? You seem different." "I'm exactly the same person I've always been," I said truthfully. "I'm just not pretending anymore that my time and energy are infinite resources for other people to consume without consideration." That conversation set the tone for what followed. Over the next several weeks, I systematically withdrew from the various ways I had been subsidizing Daniel and Tessa's lifestyle. I stopped bringing elaborate Sunday dinners and suggested we meet at restaurants if they wanted to have family meals. I stopped contributing to Emma and Jake's college funds without discussion and redirected those monthly payments to my own retirement savings. I stopped accepting last-minute babysitting requests and insisted on at least a week's notice for any childcare, which I reserved the right to decline if I had other plans. Most importantly, I stopped pretending that their casual disrespect didn't hurt me. When Tessa made dismissive comments about my old-fashioned opinions, I calmly pointed out that my opinions were based on decades of experience she hadn't yet acquired. When Daniel brushed off my suggestions about the children's activities or education, I stopped offering suggestions. When family gatherings devolved into conversations that excluded me entirely, I started leaving early rather than sitting silently on the sidelines. The family's response to these changes was illuminating.
I wasn't acting like spending time with Emma and Jake was an imposition. I loved my grandchildren deeply, but I was insisting that my relationship with them be based on mutual affection rather than assumed obligation. And I was refusing to continue providing unlimited childcare services to parents who treated me like hired help rather than family. The real test came in October, when Emma's school announced they were having a Grandparents' Day program. Emma came home excited to invite me, but when she asked Tessa about it, I watched my daughter-in-law's face cycle through annoyance, calculation, and reluctant acceptance. "I suppose Grandma Evelyn could come," Tessa said with the enthusiasm of someone agreeing to have a root canal, although I should probably warn the teacher that she might not participate very actively in the activities. The implication was clear. I was too old, too out of touch, too embarrassing to be a proper representative of Emma's family. I was acceptable as a babysitter or emergency contact, but as an actual grandmother who might interact with other families and reflect on Emma's home life, I was a liability to be managed. That's when I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of attending Emma's Grandparents' Day and enduring Tessa's barely concealed embarrassment, I took Emma out for a private grandmother-granddaughter day the weekend before the school event. Just the two of us. No parents to monitor our conversation or redirect our activities toward more appropriate pursuits. We went to the art museum downtown, where Emma was fascinated by the jewelry exhibit and spent an hour sketching designs for her own imaginary creations. We had lunch at a fancy tea room where Emma practiced using proper table manners, and I taught her how to fold napkins into flower shapes. We went to the bookstore, and I bought her 3 books she chose herself, without any input from her parents about whether they were appropriate or educational enough. Most importantly, we talked. Really talked, in a way that hadn't happened in years of chaperoned visits and carefully supervised interactions. "Grandma," Emma said as we shared a piece of chocolate cake at the tea room, "why don't you come over as much as you used to?" It was a fair question, and one I had been dreading. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that her parents view your presence as an inconvenience? How do you help a child understand that love sometimes requires boundaries, even when those boundaries are painful? "Sometimes adults need to make changes in their relationships," I said carefully.
I wanted to make sure that when I spend time with you and Jake, it's because we all want to be together, not because anyone feels obligated. Emma considered this with the seriousness children bring to concepts they don't quite understand but recognize as important. "Do Mommy and Daddy not want you to come over?" she asked. "Your parents love me," I said, which was true, even if their love had become complicated by resentment and taken for granted assumptions. But sometimes families need to find new ways of spending time together. That's why I wanted to have a special day with just you. "I like having a special day," Emma said decisively. "Can we do this again?" "I would love that," I said, and meant it completely. That afternoon with Emma reminded me of something I had lost sight of during years of trying to maintain family harmony at the expense of my own dignity. My relationship with my grandchildren didn't have to be mediated by their parents' comfort level. I could have a direct, authentic connection with Emma and Jake that wasn't filtered through Tessa's concerns about my appropriateness or Daniel's guilt about his obligations to his aging mother. I started planning regular outings with Emma and Jake, always with Daniel and Tessa's permission, but without their involvement. Museum visits, trips to the library, afternoons at the park where we could talk without adult supervision. The children, I discovered, were hungry for this kind of focused attention from an adult who wasn't simultaneously managing household logistics or checking her phone for work emergencies. During one of these outings, Jake asked me a question that broke my heart and clarified my thinking simultaneously. "Grandma, are you sad a lot?" "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" "You always seem sad when you're at our house, like you want to say something, but you can't." Out of the mouths of babes. This child had observed something that the adults in his life had either failed to notice or chosen to ignore. That I had become a ghost in my own family, present but voiceless, tolerated but not truly welcomed. "I think I sometimes have been sad," I admitted, "but I'm working on that. I'm learning to speak up more about what I want and how I feel." "Good," Jake said with satisfaction. "It's better when you're not sad." These conversations with Emma and Jake gradually revealed the extent to which my absence of boundaries had affected not just my relationship with Daniel and Tessa, but my relationship with my grandchildren as well. By trying so hard to be the perfect, undemanding grandmother, I had become a person my grandchildren pitied, rather than someone they could respect and connect with authentically. Children, it turns out, are much more perceptive about family dynamics than adults give them credit for. Emma and Jake had both noticed that their parents treated me dismissively, and they had internalized the message that Grandma Evelyn was someone whose feelings really didn't matter. My failure to stand up for myself hadn't protected them from family tension. It had taught them that some people's dignity was expendable. By October, my new approach to family relationships had created a kind of Cold War atmosphere during the increasingly rare occasions when we were all together. Daniel and Tessa were clearly frustrated by my unavailability and my refusal to absorb their subtle criticisms without response. But they hadn't yet figured out how to address the situation directly. The confrontation I had been expecting finally came in November, during what turned out to be my last family dinner at their house. I had agreed to Sunday dinner with the caveat that I would bring dessert rather than cooking the entire meal, and I would leave by 7 p.m. because I had plans to watch a movie with my neighbor Agnes. These conditions had clearly annoyed Tessa, who was accustomed to my open-ended availability, but she had agreed. The dinner itself was fine. Perfectly adequate food, polite conversation about the children's school activities, careful avoidance of any topics that might require my input or opinions. I was pleasant, but not effusive, present, but not intrusive, exactly the kind of dinner guest anyone would be happy to host. But as I was preparing to leave at 7 o'clock as I had specified, Tessa made a comment that revealed exactly how she viewed my new boundaries. "It's too bad you can't stay longer, Evelyn," she said with obviously false regret. "The children barely got to spend any time with you." The implication was clear. I was being selfish by honoring my own schedule, prioritizing my plans over my grandchildren's needs, failing in my primary obligation as a grandmother to be infinitely available. 8 months earlier, that comment would have sent me into a spiral of guilt and self-doubt. I would have canceled my plans with Agnes, stayed until the children's bedtime, and spent the evening trying to prove that I was still the devoted grandmother they remembered.
Instead, I looked at Tessa calmly and said, "The children and I had a lovely conversation during dinner. Quality time isn't measured by hours spent in the same room." "But they so rarely get to see you anymore," Tessa pressed, apparently determined to make me feel guilty about my reduced availability. "They see me every other Saturday for our special outings," I said evenly, "and I talk to them on the phone twice a week. That's actually more focused attention than they were getting when I was here more frequently, but trying to juggle childcare with cooking and cleaning." Daniel, who had been clearing dishes and pretending not to listen to this exchange, finally spoke up. "Mom, I think what Tessa is trying to say is that we miss having you around more. You seem so distant lately." Distant? As if my refusal to be taken for granted was a character flaw rather than a healthy boundary. "I'm exactly as close as I've always been to people who treat me with respect and consideration," I said. "I'm distant from people who treat me like an obligation or an inconvenience." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken accusations and hurt feelings. Tessa's face flushed with anger, and Daniel looked like he was struggling to process what I had just said. "That's not fair," Tessa said finally. "We've never treated you like an inconvenience." The audacity of that statement, delivered by a woman I had overheard wondering why I was still alive, was breathtaking. But I had learned not to expect self-awareness from people who had grown comfortable with their own cruelty. "Haven't you?" I asked quietly. "Because from where I stand, it seems like my value to this family has been entirely based on what I can provide, rather than who I am as a person." "That's ridiculous," Daniel interjected. "You're our family. Of course we value you for who you are." "When was the last time either of you asked about my interests, my opinions, or my plans that didn't involve serving your needs?" I asked. "When was the last time you invited me somewhere because you thought I would enjoy it, rather than because you needed childcare or help with something?" They didn't answer, because we all knew the answer was never. "When was the last time you included me in a conversation as an equal participant rather than politely tolerating my presence until you could redirect the discussion to topics that interested you more?" Still no answer. "I'm not asking to be the center of attention. I'm asking to be treated like a person whose thoughts and feelings matter, whose presence adds value to your lives beyond the practical services I can provide." "Of course your presence adds value," Daniel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Does it?" I asked. Because Tessa seemed to have some different thoughts on that subject when she was discussing my existence with someone on the phone a few weeks ago. Tessa's face went white. She knew exactly what conversation I was referring to, and she knew I had heard it. "I don't know what you think you heard," she began, but I cut her off. "I heard my daughter-in-law wondering why I was still alive. I heard her describing my presence at family gatherings as pointless and uncomfortable. I heard her suggest that it would be kinder if I just slipped away quietly." Daniel turned to stare at his wife, his expression shifting from confusion to horror as he processed what I was telling him. "Tessa, please tell me Mom is misunderstanding something." But Tessa's guilty silence was answer enough. I gathered my purse and jacket with the dignity of someone who had finally stopped pretending that love could exist without respect. "I want you to know," I said, addressing both of them, but primarily looking at Daniel, "that I don't hate you. I'm not trying to punish you,
But I'm also not going to continue participating in relationships where my worth is questioned and my presence is merely tolerated. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. I've spent the last 8 years trying to earn affection from people who had already decided I was disposable. I'm done with that project. From now on, I'll be available to family members who genuinely want me in their lives, not to family members who feel obligated to include me. "Mom, wait!" Daniel called, but I was already leaving. I drove home in complete silence, feeling lighter than I had in years. The conversation had been painful, but it had also been clarifying. I was no longer operating under any illusions about my place in Daniel and Tessa's life, and I was no longer willing to accept scraps of attention from people who viewed my existence as an inconvenience. That was the last time I set foot in Daniel and Tessa's house. Over the following weeks, I began the practical work of disentangling myself from their lives completely. I canceled my contributions to Emma and Jake's college funds and redirected the money to my own retirement account. I arranged to have my regular outings with the children meet at neutral locations, museums, parks, restaurants, rather than picking them up from their house. I stopped accepting dinner invitations and stopped extending them. Most significantly, I began the process of selling my house and moving to a smaller apartment. The house decision surprised everyone, including me. I had lived in that 4-bedroom colonial for 38 years, had raised my children there, had planned to die there. But as I walked through the rooms where I had spent decades putting everyone else's needs before my own, I realized that the house had become a monument to my own self-erasure. Every room held memories of sacrifices I had made, dreams I had deferred, parts of myself I had abandoned to make space for other people's priorities. The sewing room I had converted to a guest room when Daniel moved back home after college. The garden I had maintained for family gatherings no one appreciated. The kitchen where I had cooked thousands of meals for people who had grown to expect my labor without acknowledging my generosity. I didn't want to die in that house, surrounded by evidence of a life spent in service to people who had forgotten to see me as human. The apartment I found was perfect in its modest simplicity. 2 bedrooms, one for me and one for Emma and Jake when they visited. A small kitchen that encouraged cooking for pleasure rather than obligation. A living room with space for my books and comfortable chairs for reading. A tiny balcony where I could grow herbs and flowers for my own enjoyment. The day I signed the lease, I felt like I was signing a declaration of independence. Moving gave me the opportunity to sort through decades of accumulated possessions and decide what belonged in my new, intentionally smaller life. I donated most of my furniture to charity, keeping only the pieces that brought me genuine joy. I gave away boxes of books, clothes, and household items to organizations that would appreciate them. Most importantly, I went through years of family photographs and letters, keeping the ones that reminded me of genuine happiness and discarding the ones that represented obligations fulfilled rather than memories treasured.
The process was simultaneously heartbreaking and liberating. I found pictures of myself from 20, 30, 40 years ago. Pictures of a woman who looked confident, engaged, fully present in her own life. I had forgotten that person existed, had let her disappear so gradually that I hadn't noticed her absence until I saw her face looking back at me from faded photographs. I also found years of Mother's Day cards and birthday cards from Daniel, filled with generic sentiments about appreciation and love. Reading them now, with the clarity that comes from finally understanding how little I had actually been valued, I could see how empty they were. Polite acknowledgments of my role rather than genuine expressions of affection for me as a person. I kept exactly 3 cards. One from Daniel's childhood that included a specific memory of something we had done together, and 2 from Emma and Jake that were clearly written by them rather than dictated by their parents. The rest went in the recycling bin, along with years of Christmas newsletters and family photos that told the story of my gradual disappearance from my own family's narrative. The move itself was surprisingly easy. I hired professional movers and completed the transition over a single weekend, leaving Daniel and Tessa to discover my relocation when they drove by the old house and saw the "sold" sign in the yard. Daniel called that evening, his voice tight with confusion and hurt. "Mom, Mrs. Patterson said you moved out yesterday. Why didn't you tell us you were selling the house?" "I didn't realize I needed your permission to make decisions about my own property," I said calmly. "Of course you don't need permission, but this is a big decision. We're your family. We should have been part of the conversation." "Were you part of the conversation when you and Tessa decided I was too old and irrelevant to be included in your lives?" I asked. "Did you consult me before determining that my presence was merely tolerated rather than welcomed?" That's not the same thing, isn't it? You made decisions about our relationship without including me. I'm making decisions about my life without including you. The principle seems identical. "But where are you living? What if there's an emergency? What if you need help with something?" His concern might have been touching if it weren't so transparently about his own anxiety rather than my well-being. Daniel wasn't worried about my safety or happiness. He was worried about losing access to me as a resource, about what people would think when they learned his mother had moved without telling him where. "I'm living in a lovely apartment that meets my needs perfectly, and I've arranged for all the support systems I require. You don't need to worry about me." "Can I at least have your new address? What if the children want to visit?" "Emma and Jake have my address. I see them every other Saturday, as I have for the past several months. Those arrangements haven't changed." "But what about family emergencies? What if something happens to one of the kids and we need to reach you?" "You have my phone number, Daniel. It's the same number I've had for 15 years. If there's a genuine emergency involving the children, you can call me." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Daniel cycling through various attempts to make me feel guilty about my decision to move without consulting him. He was hurt that I hadn't trusted him with my plans. He was worried about what the neighbors would think. He was concerned about my ability to manage a move at my age. He was confused about why I was pulling away from the family when we all needed each other. What he wasn't, I noticed, was curious about whether I was happy with my decision, whether the apartment met my needs, or whether there was anything he could do to support me during this transition. His entire focus was on how my choices affected him rather than on understanding why I had made them. "Daniel," I said finally, cutting through his litany of concerns, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. I am 72 years old. I have been managing my own affairs successfully for over 50 years. I do not need your permission, your approval, or your management of my life decisions. What I need is your respect for my autonomy and my judgment." "Of course I respect you, Mom. No," I interrupted. "If you respected me, you would have asked how you could support my decision rather than immediately assuming it was wrong. If you respected me, you would have noticed that I've been unhappy in our family dynamic for years and tried to understand why. If you respected me, you wouldn't have allowed your wife to treat me like an inconvenience while you stood by and said nothing." The silence that followed was loaded with everything we hadn't said to each other for years. "I love you, Daniel," I continued, my voice softer but no less firm. "But I'm no longer willing to accept being loved as an obligation rather than being loved as a person. When you're ready to have a relationship with me based on mutual respect and genuine affection, I'll be here. Until then, I'll be living my own life on my own terms. I hung up before he could respond, and I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. The first few months in my apartment were like learning to inhabit my own life again. I woke up each morning with no obligations except the ones I chose to accept. I ate breakfast slowly, reading the newspaper and drinking coffee that was exactly the temperature I preferred. I planned my days around my own interests and energy levels rather than around other people's emergencies and expectations. I joined a watercolor class at the community center and discovered I had a decent eye for color composition. I started volunteering at the library's literacy program, helping adults learn to read. Work that felt meaningful in a way that babysitting for ungrateful family members never had. I reconnected with old friends I had lost touch with during my years of family servitude, women like Doris and Beatrice and Agnes who had maintained their own identities even as they navigated the complex demands of being wives, mothers, and grandmothers. Most importantly, I learned to enjoy my own company. For years, I had filled every moment with activities designed to benefit other people, and I had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist for my own pleasure. I read novels without guilt about whether I should be doing something more productive. I took long walks without a destination, just for the joy of moving through the world at my own pace. I cooked elaborate meals for myself and ate them slowly, savoring flavors and textures without rushing to clean up and move on to the next task. It was during one of these quiet Saturday afternoons, about 3 months after the move, that Emma called me directly for the first time. "Grandma Evelyn?" Her voice was small and uncertain through the phone. "Hello, sweetheart. How are you?"
I'm okay. Grandma, can I ask you something? Of course. Are you mad at Mommy and Daddy? It was a question I had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. How do you explain adult relationship dynamics to a 7-year-old without damaging her sense of security or putting her in the middle of conflicts she shouldn't have to navigate? I'm not mad, Emma, I said carefully, but I am sad about some things that happened, and I needed to make some changes in my life to feel better. What kind of changes? Well, I moved to a new apartment that makes me very happy, and I'm spending my time doing things that are interesting and fun for me. And I'm making sure that when I spend time with people, it's because we both want to be together. Do you not want to be with us anymore? My heart broke a little at the vulnerability in her voice. This child was trying to understand adult complexities that shouldn't have been her burden to carry. Emma, I love you and Jake more than I can possibly explain, I said firmly. I will always want to spend time with you. That's why we have our special Saturday adventures. Because being with you makes me happy, and I hope being with me makes you happy too. It does, she said immediately. I love our Saturday days. Good. Those aren't changing. But sometimes adults need to have different relationships with other adults, even when they're family. It doesn't mean the love goes away, but it might mean that how we spend time together changes. Is that why you don't come to Sunday dinner anymore? That's part of it, yes. I miss you at Sunday dinner. I miss you too, sweetheart, but I see you every other Saturday and we talk on the phone, and I love hearing about everything that's happening in your life. We talked for another few minutes about her art projects and her reading progress, and when she hung up, I felt both heartbroken and proud. Heartbroken because this child was having to process adult relationship failures that should never have touched her world. Proud because I was managing to maintain my relationship with Emma and Jake as I established boundaries with their parents. That phone call made me realize that my withdrawal from Daniel and Tessa's lives was creating confusion and pain for Emma and Jake that I needed to address more directly. They were too young to understand the nuances of what had happened, but they were old enough to notice that family dynamics had changed and to worry that they were somehow responsible. I decided to write them each a letter, something they could keep and reread as they got older and better able to understand the complexities of adult relationships. Emma's letter explained that grandmothers and parents sometimes need to have different kinds of relationships, but that my love for her was constant and unchanging. I told her about my new apartment and my painting classes and my volunteer work, helping her understand that I was happy and healthy and building a life that brought me joy. I promised that our Saturday adventures would continue for as long as she wanted them, and I encouraged her to call me anytime she wanted to talk. Jake's letter was similar, but adapted for his 5-year-old vocabulary and attention span. I drew pictures to illustrate my points and included a small photo of my apartment so he could visualize where I lived. I mailed the letters on a Wednesday and got calls from both children by Saturday, excited to tell me they had received real mail with their names on the envelopes. The conversations that followed were easier than I had expected. Children, it turns out, are remarkably adaptable when adults are honest with them about what's happening and consistent in their care and attention. It was around this time that I began to notice changes in how Daniel was responding to our new dynamic. His initial anger and confusion had gradually shifted to what seemed like genuine sadness and occasionally something that looked like understanding. He started calling me more regularly, not to complain about my unavailability or to try to guilt me back into my old role, but to actually check on how I was doing. The conversations were still awkward, stilted by years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding, but they felt more authentic than our interactions had been in years. "Mom," he said during one of these calls, "I've been thinking about what you said about respect and appreciation, and I think maybe you were right about some things." It wasn't a full apology, but it was an acknowledgement that my feelings had been valid, which was more than I had expected from him. "I'm glad you're thinking about it," I said neutrally. "Daniel and I have been talking, and we realized that we probably took you for granted. We got so used to you being available for everything that we stopped thinking about whether we were asking too much or giving back enough." "That's very honest of you to recognize. The thing is, we miss you. The kids miss you. And I know we can't go back to how things were, but I'm wondering if there's a way to start over maybe, to build something better." I was quiet for a long moment, not because I didn't know how to respond, but because I wanted to choose my words carefully. Daniel was offering what sounded like the beginning of the kind of relationship I had always wanted with him, one based on mutual respect rather than assumed obligation. But I had learned to be wary of promises made in the heat of regret, and I needed to see consistent actions rather than just good intentions. "I would be open to that," I said finally, "but it would have to be a genuinely different kind of relationship. It would have to be based on both of us valuing what the other person brings to the family, not just on me providing services and you accepting them." "I understand," Daniel said, though I wasn't sure he fully grasped what that would look like in practice. "What would that look like, do you think?" "It would look like you asking about my interests and opinions, not just updating me on your life. It would look like invitations to spend time together that are about enjoying each other's company, not about me helping with something. It would look like you defending me when other people treat me dismissively, instead of staying silent and expecting me to absorb disrespect." "That makes sense," Daniel said slowly. "And what about Tessa? I know what she said was horrible, and I should have spoken up when she was treating you badly, but she's my wife, and she's the mother of your grandchildren. Is there a way for all of us to move forward?" It was another fair question, and one I had been wrestling with. I couldn't imagine ever feeling comfortable around Tessa again, knowing what she truly thought of me, but I also recognized that my relationship with Daniel and my grandchildren would be complicated if I refused to be in the same room as his wife.
I'm willing to be civil with Tessa.
I said. But I'm not willing to pretend that what she said didn't happen, and I'm not willing to put myself in situations where I might be subjected to that kind of cruelty again. If she wants to rebuild a relationship with me, she would need to acknowledge the harm she caused and demonstrate genuine change in how she treats me. That's fair, Daniel said, though his voice suggested he wasn't looking forward to that conversation with his wife. And Daniel, I added, any rebuilding of our relationship has to be something you want for its own sake, not something you're doing because you feel guilty or because you think it's what you're supposed to do. I'm not interested in being anyone's obligation anymore. I do want it, he said quietly. I miss my mom. Not the person who is always available to help with everything, but the person who raised me and taught me how to think about the world. I miss having conversations with you that aren't about childcare logistics or family scheduling. I miss knowing what you think about things. It was the most honest thing Daniel had said to me in years, and I felt something cautiously hopeful stir in my chest. Then let's start there, I said. Let's try having conversations that are about who we are as people, not just about what we need from each other. Over the following months, Daniel and I began the slow work of rebuilding our relationship on more solid ground. He started calling me to ask about my painting classes and my volunteer work, not just to update me on Emma and Jake's activities. He invited me to lunch occasionally, just the two of us, where we talked about books and current events and childhood memories that didn't revolve around his current needs or problems. Most importantly, he started treating me like someone whose opinions were worth hearing and whose presence added value to family interactions beyond the practical services I could provide. The change wasn't immediate or complete. Patterns developed over decades don't disappear overnight. But it was real, and it was sustained, and it gave me hope that we might eventually have the kind of adult parent-child relationship I had always wanted. Tessa was a different story entirely. She never apologized for what she had said about wishing I were dead. She never acknowledged that her treatment of me had been cruel or inappropriate. When Daniel apparently talked to her about my conditions for rebuilding our relationship, her response was to become even more distant and formal with me, as if my request for basic decency were unreasonable and vindictive. During the few occasions when we were in the same space, Emma's birthday party, Jake's school play, Tessa treated me with the kind of cold politeness typically reserved for unwelcome acquaintances. She was never overtly rude, but she made it clear through body language and tone that she viewed my presence as an imposition she was graciously tolerating. I found, somewhat to my surprise, that I was completely comfortable with this dynamic. I had no desire to be friends with someone who casually wished for my death, and I felt no obligation to make her comfortable with my continued existence. I was civil when civility was required, but I made no effort to win her approval or ease her obvious discomfort with my presence. The person who surprised me most during this period of family reconstruction was my granddaughter, Emma. As she grew older, she turned 8, then 9, she seemed to develop an increasingly sophisticated understanding of the family dynamics that had been invisible to her when she was younger. She started asking more pointed questions about why I had moved, why I didn't come to Sunday dinners anymore, why Mommy seemed different when I was around. During one of our Saturday outings, as we sat in the museum cafe after spending the morning looking at Impressionist paintings, Emma asked me a question that revealed how much she had been observing and processing the family dynamics. "Grandma Evelyn, did Mommy say something mean to you?" I paused with my coffee cup halfway to my lips. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart? Because you used to come over all the time, and now you don't. And when you do come over,
Mommy acts weird, like she's nervous or something, and Daddy looks sad when he talks about you. This child was far more perceptive than any of the adults in her life had given her credit for. She had been watching and listening and drawing conclusions about family relationships that the grown-ups thought they were hiding from her. I said carefully, "Sometimes adults have disagreements, and sometimes those disagreements change how they spend time together. But you're not disagreeing with me and Jake, right? You still want to spend time with us." Emma, I will always want to spend time with you and Jake," I said firmly. "Nothing that happens between me and other adults will ever change how much I love you both." "Good," she said with satisfaction, "because I like our Saturday days better than regular family dinners anyway. We get to do more interesting things, and you listen to me more." It was a casual comment, but it hit me like a revelation. This child had noticed that my attention was more focused and genuine during our one-on-one time than it had been when I was trying to manage multiple family relationships simultaneously. She preferred the authentic, engaged grandmother I had become to the overwhelmed, trying to please everyone grandmother I had been. "I like our Saturday days too," I told her. "They're some of my favorite times." "Mine too," Emma said, then paused thoughtfully. "Grandma, can I tell you something?" "Of course." "I think Mommy is jealous of you." "Jealous? Why would you think that?" "Because you're braver than she is. You move to your own apartment and you take art classes and you do things by yourself. Mommy always says she wants to do things, but then she never does them. She just complains about being too busy or too tired." I was stunned by the accuracy of this observation. Emma had identified something I hadn't fully recognized myself. That my transformation from self-sacrificing grandmother to independent woman might have triggered Tess's own insecurities about the choices she had made in her life. "That's very perceptive," I said. "Sometimes when people see someone else making changes they admire, it can make them feel uncomfortable about their own choices. Is that why she doesn't like you anymore?" "I think that might be part of it," I admitted. "But Emma, this is not your job to worry about these adult problems. Your job is to be a kid and enjoy your childhood." "I know, but I still think you're brave, and I want to be brave like you when I grow up."
As my second year in the apartment drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on the magnitude of the changes I had made and their cumulative impact on my happiness and sense of self-worth. I was genuinely content in a way I hadn't been for decades, not just absence of unhappiness, but active, daily satisfaction with my life and choices. I had friendships based on mutual interest and affection rather than shared obligations. I had hobbies that engaged my creativity and intellect. I had a living space that reflected my personal taste rather than what I thought other people expected. I had relationships with my grandchildren that were built on genuine connection rather than assumed duty. Most importantly, I had reclaimed my right to take up space in the world without apology. The woman who had stood behind those rose bushes 2 years ago, listening to her daughter-in-law wish for her death, felt like a stranger to me now. That woman had been so afraid of being unlovable that she had made herself unlovable, not because she lacked worth, but because she had trained everyone around her to treat her as if she had no worth. The process of change hadn't been easy or painless. There had been moments of doubt, times when I wondered if I was being too harsh or too demanding, occasions when the loneliness of setting boundaries felt overwhelming. But the alternative, returning to a life of invisible servitude and accumulated resentment, was no longer acceptable to me. On my 73rd birthday, I threw myself a party. It was a small gathering. Doris, Beatrice, Agnes, and a few other friends from my painting class and volunteer work.
Emma and Jake came for the afternoon, bringing handmade cards and helping me blow out the candles on the cake I had ordered from my favorite bakery. Daniel stopped by briefly, bringing flowers and staying long enough to have a piece of cake and a genuine conversation about my volunteer work at the Literacy Center. Tessa did not attend, which surprised no one and disappointed no one. As my friends were leaving that evening, Doris pulled me aside. "Evelyn," she said, "I want you to know how proud I am of you. When I first met you at book club 2 years ago, you seemed like you were disappearing into yourself. Now look at you. You're glowing with life." "Thank you," I said, meaning it completely. "I feel more like myself than I have in decades." "Good," Doris said firmly. "You spent too many years making yourself small for people who didn't appreciate the gift they were receiving. I'm glad you finally decided you deserve better." After everyone had gone home, I sat on my small balcony with a glass of wine and the birthday cards Emma and Jake had made me. Emma's card featured a watercolor painting of us at the art museum with "Best Grandma Ever" written in careful cursive. Jake's card was a drawing of me in my apartment, surrounded by flowers and books with "Happy birthday, Grandma Evelyn, I love you" in his distinctive 5-year-old handwriting. These cards, I realized, were the first birthday cards I had received in years that were about me as a person, rather than me as a role. My grandchildren saw me clearly, as someone who loved art and books and flowers, someone who listened to them and made time for their interests, someone who created a life that brought her joy. They saw me as Evelyn, not just as Grandma. As I sat there in the gathering darkness, I thought about Tessa's cruel question from 2 years ago. Why is she even still alive? Now I could answer that question with complete certainty. I was still alive to remember my own name, to recognize my own worth, to claim my own space in the world. I was still alive to show Emma and Jake that women could choose themselves without guilt or apology. I was still alive to demonstrate that dignity was not negotiable, that love without respect was not actually love, that it was never too late to start treating yourself like someone who mattered. I was still alive to set my own table, to plant my own flowers, to fill my own days with activities that brought me satisfaction and purpose. I was still alive to prove that a woman's value extended far beyond her utility to others, that her dreams and preferences and boundaries were valid regardless of her age or family role. I was still alive because I had finally learned that being alive meant more than just continuing to breathe while serving everyone else's needs. Being alive meant occupying your own life fully, making choices based on your own values, refusing to accept treatment that diminished your humanity. 3 months after my 73rd birthday, I received a letter from Daniel. Not a phone call or a text message, but an actual handwritten letter delivered through the mail. The letter was 3 pages long, written in Daniel's careful engineer script, and it was the most honest communication I had received from him in decades. He wrote about his regret for taking me for granted, his shame about allowing Tessa to treat me dismissively, his recognition that he had failed me as a son in fundamental ways. He wrote about his memories of me as a young mother, how you had supported his interests and ambitions, how you had taught him to think independently and treat other people with kindness. He wrote about his confusion when those lessons seemed to disappear from our relationship as he became an adult, and his recent understanding that the problem hadn't been my teaching, but his willingness to forget what he had learned. Most importantly, he wrote about his genuine desire to rebuild our relationship on the foundation of mutual respect and affection that I had requested. He ended the letter with a request. "Would you do willing to have dinner with me next week, just the 2 of us, somewhere nice, so we can talk about who we are now and who we want to be to each other going forward?" I read the letter 3 times, then set it aside for 2 days while I thought about how to respond. The letter felt genuine in a way Daniel's previous apologies had not. It demonstrated actual understanding of what had gone wrong in our relationship rather than just generic regret about my unhappiness. It acknowledged specific failures and took responsibility for specific harm. It made no demands and offered no pressure, just a sincere request for the opportunity to do better. I called Daniel on a Thursday evening. "I got your letter," I said when he answered the phone. "Thank you for reading it," he replied. "I know I don't have any right to expect forgiveness or another chance, but I would like to have dinner with you," I interrupted. "Next Friday, if that works for you, but I want to choose the restaurant." "Of course," Daniel said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. "Wherever you'd like to go." I chose a small Italian restaurant downtown that I had discovered during my months of learning to dine alone without embarrassment. The food was excellent. The atmosphere was warm without being overly intimate. And it was a place where I felt comfortable and confident rather than accommodating. The dinner was unlike any conversation Daniel and I had ever had as adults. Instead of him updating me on his life while I listened and offered support, we had an actual dialogue about our individual experiences, opinions, and perspectives. He asked about my painting and seemed genuinely interested in my descriptions of color theory and composition techniques. I asked about his work and discovered aspects of his engineering projects that I had never understood before.
We talked about books we were reading, places we wanted to travel, memories from his childhood that we both treasured. We talked about Emma and Jake not as logistics to be managed, but as individual people with their own emerging personalities and interests. Most importantly, we talked about our relationship itself, what had gone wrong, what we both wanted going forward, how we could build something healthier and more sustainable. "I think I forgot that you were a person separate from being my mother," Daniel said as we shared dessert. "I got so focused on what I needed from you that I stopped seeing what you needed from me." "I think I forgot I was allowed to have needs," I admitted. "I got so focused on being useful that I stopped believing I had value beyond what I could provide." "You have tremendous value," Daniel said firmly. "You always have. I'm sorry it took me so long to remember how to see it." It wasn't a magical reconciliation that erased decades of accumulated hurt, but it was a genuine beginning. As Daniel walked me to my car after dinner, I felt cautiously optimistic that we might actually be able to build the kind of adult relationship I had always wanted with my son. "Mom," Daniel said as I was unlocking my car door, "I want you to know that things are going to be different with Tessa, too. I've told her that her behavior towards you is unacceptable and that if she wants to be part of this family, she needs to treat you with respect." I looked at him carefully. "And how did she respond to that?" Daniel's expression tightened slightly. "She's adjusting to the idea. But I've made it clear that this isn't negotiable. You're my mother, and you deserve to be treated with dignity in your own son's home." I appreciated Daniel's intentions, but I learned to be realistic about people's capacity for genuine change, especially when that change was being imposed from outside rather than arising from internal recognition of wrongdoing. "I hope she finds a way to adjust," I said diplomatically. "But Daniel, I want you to understand that I'm not waiting for Tessa's approval or acceptance to live my life. I'm happy to be civil with her, but I'm not interested in trying to win her over or prove my worth to her." "I understand, and I respect that. I just want you to know that I'm not going to stand by silently anymore if anyone treats you badly." It was a promise I had needed to hear for years, even if it was coming later than I wished. 6 months later, I was invited to Emma's 9th birthday party, not as an obligation or an afterthought, but as a genuinely welcomed guest.
The invitation came directly from Emma, who called me herself to ask if I would come and whether I would bring my watercolor paints so I could help her and her friends make birthday cards. The party was different from family gatherings I remembered from my years of invisible servitude. I was included in conversations, asked for my opinions about the activities, treated as someone whose presence added value to the celebration. Daniel made a point of introducing me to other parents, not as the grandmother who helps with childcare, but as my mother, who's an artist and volunteers with adult literacy programs. Even Tessa, while not warm, was politely respectful in a way that felt genuine rather than performative. But the real revelation was watching Emma navigate the party as a confident, articulate 9-year-old who clearly felt comfortable asserting her own preferences and boundaries. When one of her friends criticized her choice of party games, Emma calmly explained why she had selected those activities and suggested her friend could organize her own party differently if she preferred. When an adult guest talked over her while she was explaining her birthday wishes, Emma politely but firmly asked if she could finish her thought. She was displaying exactly the kind of self-respect and boundary setting that I had struggled to learn in my 70s. Somehow, through watching my own transformation, she had absorbed lessons about personal worth and appropriate treatment that would serve her throughout her life. After the party, as I was packing up my art supplies, Emma came over to thank me for helping with the card-making activity. "Grandma Evelyn, I'm really glad you came today." "I'm glad I came too, sweetheart. I had a wonderful time." "You know what I like about you now?" Emma asked, leaning against my chair with the casual intimacy of a child who felt completely secure in our relationship. "What's that?" "You seem happy, like really happy, not just pretending to be happy." It was such a perceptive observation that I had to pause in my packing to look at her fully. "You're absolutely right. I am really happy, much happier than I was before." "Good," Emma said with satisfaction. "Everyone should be really happy, not just pretending." As I drove home from the party, I reflected on Emma's simple but profound observation. She had noticed something that I was still occasionally surprised to recognize myself, that I was genuinely content with my life in a way that I hadn't been for decades. I wasn't happy because I had gotten revenge on people who had mistreated me. I wasn't happy because I had punished Daniel and Tessa for their years of taking me for granted. I was happy because I had reclaimed my right to live as a complete person rather than a convenient resource, because I had learned to treat myself with the same consideration I had always extended to others, because I had finally answered Tessa's cruel question in the most definitive way possible. I was still alive because I remembered my name, because I learned to set my own table, because I chose to occupy my own life fully instead of existing in the margins of everyone else's story. 2.5 years after I first heard my daughter-in-law wonder why I was still breathing, I was not just surviving, but thriving. I had built a life that reflected my values and interests, maintained relationships based on mutual respect and affection, and created a legacy that would benefit people who actually appreciated what I could offer. I had proven that it was never too late to stop accepting unacceptable treatment, never too late to choose yourself, never too late to insist on being seen as a person worthy of love and respect. I was still alive because life, it turned out, was worth living when you lived it as yourself.